Our second reading this morning comes from the book of Habakkuk, chapter 1, verses 5 through 17, and continues the journey in Habakkuk that we began last week. It begins with Habakkuk answering God's cry in verses 1 through 4, and it ends with Habakkuk's response to God's answer. It's found on page 762 of your Pew Bibles. I encourage you to follow along. Look at the nations and see. Be astonished. Be astounded. For a work is being done in your days that you would not believe if you were told. For I am rousing the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Dread and fearsome are they. Their justice and dignity proceed from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more menacing than wolves at dusk. Their horses charge, their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence. With faces pressing forward, they gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and of rulers they make sport. They laugh at every fortress and heap up earth to take it. Then they sweep by like the wind. They transgress and become guilty. Their own might is their God. Are you not from of old, O Lord my God, my Holy One? You shall not die. O Lord, you have marked them for judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for punishment. Your eyes are too pure to behold evil, and you cannot look on wrongdoing. Why do you look on the treacherous and are silent when the wicked swallow those more righteous than they? You have made people like fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. The enemy brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his seine, so he rejoices and exalts. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his seine, for by them his portion is lavish and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his nets and destroying nations without mercy? The word of the Lord. So, what are your conversations with God like? What do you pray for? For many, prayer is kind of a mysterious thing. What kind of language do you use in your prayers? Do you interrogate God, as Dale suggested last week? I was brought up in a religious family, and devotions and prayer were a part of everyday life. Not in the liturgical sense that many of you are familiar with, but around meals. We always thank God for the food. We ask for his continued blessing, and often we prayed for the health and well-being of friends and family we knew, including missionaries in Africa. But I don't remember much thought or talk about how God answered our prayers. I'll spare you the long version, but prayer has become way more important and meaningful to me in the 50 years since my childhood. If you were to ask me to define prayer today, I would probably say something like it's a conversation with God. And that's exactly the point that today's scripture reading begins to get my attention. There's actually a later section in Habakkuk entitled A Prayer of Habakkuk. It's an eloquent and poetic section, but the whole book of Habakkuk records a conversation between the prophet and God. Habakkuk addresses God, and God answers very clearly, maybe too clearly. God explains exactly what he's going to do to answer Habakkuk's concerns. Now, when I pray, I have assumptions about how God should answer my prayers. And if I tell you the truth this morning, they're fairly selfish. God, give us safety as we travel. God, heal my friends. God, protect my 401k. So when travel happens without incident, when my friend gets well, when the stock market goes up, then I say, God's answering my prayer. Just exactly the way I'd like him to. In this morning's text, God responds to Habakkuk on a whole different level. For a moment, I'll skip the significant fact that Habakkuk concerns on a whole different level than mine, and I'll just focus on what God says. God says, look at the nations. Look beyond your immediate context and see. Be astonished, for I am doing work in your day that you will not believe when I tell you. Well, of course, God is doing work in Habakkuk's day, and God's doing work in our day. In the broad sense, we know God is always at work. Good, solid Presbyterian theology reminds us that every breath we take is because of God. It's dependent upon God. Without God, we would not be able to get up and come here this morning. God was at work growing and healing and restoring and preparing for the sunrise while we all slept last night. God is not a laissez-faire God who just lets things happen as they will. He is not uninvolved. He is at work. The miracles of new birth, the beauty of waves crashing on the sea, the wonder of music that strikes a chord in our heart. We attribute all these things to God. Right in front of our noses, the sovereign God is keeping the universe running. He's present everywhere. He never slumbers. So why would God think that Habakkuk would not believe what he's told? Why wouldn't you believe that God is working when you look around and you too see things that you know are not right? Racial and economic disparities, decisions that seem to ignore the health of our planet, corruption, lying, greed that is never satisfied, meaningless violence, personal pain and suffering. As Dale reminded us last week, we all feel these things, even when we don't really want to feel these things. We, like Habakkuk, expect God to do something. So, at first, God's answer seems pretty good. Don't worry about it, Habakkuk. I'm already doing something. Now, when I read Habakkuk, my emotional imagination gets involved. And maybe it's just my warped imagination, but at this point, God seems to have a strange sense of humor. A wry smile momentarily forms on his face as he continues. Yep, Habakkuk, I am doing a work in your day. I'm rousing the Chaldeans, that fierce, impetuous nation who marched through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Dread and fearsome are they. Their justice and dignity proceed from themselves. And then God goes on to describe their fierce military tactics. Now, modern behavioral psychologists tell us that we see what we expect to see. We hear what we want to hear. But this is not what Habakkuk expects to hear. It's not what he wants to hear. God was right. Habakkuk is astonished. Do you feel the surprise too? God comes back at Habakkuk with the intensity that matches Habakkuk's original concern. And now Habakkuk has more than the frustration of waiting for God. For him, this is a clash between my will and thy will. God is not fitting into Habakkuk's plan. Habakkuk is being fit into God's plan. What does it mean for us when God's answer, when God's work is not what I'm hoping? When it's not what I'm expecting, when it's not even what I think it should be? Well, let me add a little more historic background that sharpens our understanding of God's reply to Habakkuk. The Chaldeans were a military tribe of the Babylonians. As Dale told us last week, the Babylonians were a world superpower around 600 BC when Habakkuk probably lived. The other was Egypt. Judah was the small state caught between the two. In the ever-advancing science of warfare, the Chaldeans learned from the Assyrians, who they had just recently defeated. They had methods for quickly building siege ramps to take fortified cities. Their cavalry was fast and powerful. It seemed there was no stopping them. Their military technology allowed them to do whatever they wanted. They were brutal. From Judah's perspective, they were pagan and worshiped their own strength and power. Habakkuk talks of fish and creeping things as a metaphor for their subhuman treatment of the people they captured. They were not soldiers walking humbly with God. Habakkuk also knew some important history. About 100 years before, Assyria had destroyed the northern kingdom and deported its remaining people. The northern kingdom, Israel, was Judah's sister Jewish state. While there was constantly bickering between the two, they were kin, and they were a lot alike. The northern kingdom was also full of injustice and idolatry. In Habakkuk's day, and through the rest of the Bible, Israel's destruction was seen as God's judgment. So God answers Habakkuk's complaint. He's bringing an enemy to address, to judge the injustice and immorality that Habakkuk sees around him in Judah. On one important level, Habakkuk gets it. God has raised up the Babylonians for judgment. Now, judgment's not very often a comfortable topic for us. Paintings of the Last Judgment do not decorate the walls of our church or our home in these days. We avoid thinking and talking about judgment for a lot of reasons. I think one of them is that we're afraid of it. Habakkuk is not stupid. He can see the likely implications of God's work for himself and for Judah. God's answer means that things are going to get a lot worse before anything gets better. As I said, this does not seem to be the kind of solution that Habakkuk had in mind. We're never told exactly what Habakkuk did expect or hope God would do to end the violence and injustice. But to use a contemporary phrase, God's answer is way out of the box for Habakkuk. Hold on a second, God. What are you doing? God's action, using the very, very violent Chaldeans to fix the violence Habakkuk sees in Judah, makes little sense to him. Why are you doing that? Why don't you act more like God? I'm reminded of a passage in Isaiah, chapter 55, verses 8 and 9, where God tells another prophet, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God is able to do exceedingly more than we ask or imagine. And sometimes what he does is way different than we imagine. As we journey through Lent, I'm also reminded of another time when God's activity did not fit expectations. Do you remember how many times Jesus told his followers about the cross and they did not believe him? Jesus was not the kind of solution to Roman occupation or first century abuses of power for which the Jewish people were looking. Ironically, Jesus' crucifixion was in part the result of their unmet expectations about God's saving work. When we get to Good Friday, and I'm studying right here with you all, contemplating the crucifixion, I will probably again find myself muttering, "Really, God? This is an awfully extreme way for you to deal with the problems? Why was this necessary?" The same way I identify with Habakkuk's initial cry for concern, I identify with his new question about the work God is doing. Like me, Habakkuk responds to God with a mix of theological argument, confusion, and maybe sarcasm. What do you expect God to do? What is God doing in our day that's outside our expectations? What might he be doing that we can't believe, that doesn't make sense to us? Who are the Babylonians in our world? Yeah, I can see the wheels turning in some of your heads. You, like me, don't like the idea of God using some kinds of people to get his work done. Now, interesting enough, of course, when God doesn't meet our expectations, or anybody else for that matter, it means that we have expectations of some kind. We might think that Habakkuk's expectations are off base because he just doesn't know enough about God. But from the very beginning, Habakkuk has a deep understanding of God. Habakkuk's concerns for injustice probably come from his relationship with God. He knows God cares about violence and destruction and strife and contention. He knows God cares about ignored laws and injustice. He knows God has the ability to save. He knows that justice is just not a matter of what powerful people want. He knows that God calls us to walk humbly and not in arrogance. As Habakkuk questions God's work, it's apparent he knows that God is everlasting and eternal. He knows that God is pure and holy. He knows that God judges. And he understands the place that humans should have in God's creation. Do you notice that what Habakkuk knows about God is similar to the ideas we affirm in our confessions? I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. He, Jesus, ascended into heaven. He is seated on the right hand of the Father, and he will come to judge the living and the dead. You may be less familiar with the Belhar Confession now being studied in Faith Cafe. We believe in the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who gathers, protects, and cares for the church through word and spirit. This God has done since the beginning of the world and will do to the end. You wouldn't be here this morning if you did not have some ideas about God. Habakkuk is not an unbelieving skeptic. Habakkuk is a person who regularly shows up at church, and he has a personal relationship with God. Frankly, he puts me to shame by what he knows about God. Still, his understanding gets distorted in his head. I'm a fairly intuitive person. And as a result of hours spent hiking around the wooded, rural hills of western New York, I have a pretty good sense of direction. I generally do a good job navigating just by kind of observing what's around me. But every now and then, very, very, very rarely, I get turned around, and north becomes south in my head. I'm sure the ocean is over there, when it's actually in the opposite direction. And when I think I know something, I really think I know it. My own ideas get in the way of perceiving reality. It happens to Habakkuk. I know my destination is to the left. But my wife, Donna, she's less intuitive. She uses this thing called Google Maps. She'll say, "No, honey, you need to turn to your other left." In the middle of city traffic, when things might be a little stressful anyway, the argument gets interesting. Do you ever engage in an argument with someone and try to use what you think you know about them against them? You're staring at your phone. You're too focused on the details to see where we're headed. Well, honey, the roads don't go where you think they go. You've got to turn to your right, back there. Now, of course, nothing like that ever really happens in my marriage, but it's exactly what happens with Habakkuk. What he thinks he knows about God starts to get in the way of his understanding God and God's work. Your eyes are too pure to behold evil. You cannot look on wrongdoing. Why are you silent, allowing that to happen? I can't believe you do that. This doesn't make sense to me. Oh, Habakkuk, I do love you, but you don't understand how well God sees evil. True, he does not tolerate it, but he is far more concerned about it than you imagine. He is not confused. He knows the sin of the Chaldean. He names their idolatry and pronounces them guilty. He knows all the stuff Habakkuk complains about at the beginning. It is even more serious to God than it is to Habakkuk. There's no whatever with God. He does not just look the other way at wrong. There is judgment, and that should sober us. God does go to extreme measures to deal with evil. In ancient Israel, in the Chaldeans, and in us. Habakkuk's God is pure. But God not only sees evil, he experiences it. Habakkuk can't imagine a God with dirt under his fingernails and sawdust on his sandals, beaten and bloody on a cross, feeling abandoned by the Father. Ultimately, the violence is directed at God. The wicked do swallow up or nail up the one who is more righteous. God is literally silent as it happens. It is how God deals with our sin. Now, I would love to stand here this morning and make sense of that for you. I can't. It's a mystery. Somehow or other, suffering is a central part of God's love for the world and his love and care for us. As we journey through this Lenten season, how might that grow our understanding of God and his work? What is at stake here for Habakkuk is his view of God. What is at stake here is our view of God. If I were to say this morning that I know what God should do and how God should do it and when God should do it, some of you would laugh and think I was pretty foolish. It would be foolish because it would be an attempt for me to make my own God, just like the Chaldeans who create a God of their own strength. Habakkuk's own ideas are dangerously close to becoming his God. So Habakkuk begins by crying out his question about the injustice he sees. God answers, but the answer leaves Habakkuk and us with an even bigger question about God's work. I'm sure Dale will answer that question next week because the conversation between God and Habakkuk continues. There's a bit of a surprise ending to the book of Habakkuk. But today, I'll leave us here to ponder and maybe be stretched by this place in our Lenten journey. As God and Habakkuk engage, we're reminded that God is at work. There is great hope in that. We may or may not like what he's doing. God's work will probably take us to the cross. It does take us to the cross, even our own cross. But like Habakkuk, there is really no other place than God to go with our questions and doubts. What Habakkuk knows about God, it's not enough, but it is the basis for his continuing conversation. Even with his doubts, Habakkuk turns back to God and asks again, perhaps more softly, God, what are you doing in the world? Will the judgment continue without mercy? Well, even without reading ahead in Habakkuk, we have hope. Plus, we can see from the other side of the cross. Our Lenten journey does confront us with darkness. It forces us to struggle with judgment and suffering. But God is in control. He is doing a work in our day. No, the Chaldeans or any other agents of judgment are not going to keep emptying their nets and destroying nations without mercy. Thanks be to God.